Situated on over 8,000 acres, Loring Air Force Base was a USAF installation located in Aroostook County, Maine, near Limestone and Caribou. Loring's history as one of Maine's most beloved Air Force bases has long outlived its closure, which occurred in 1994. The Historic American Engineering Record wrote, quote, "Loring AFB demonstrates the military, technological, and economic complexity of the Cold War. Once one of the most heavily armed of the Strategic Air Command bases, it stands as a visible representation of the policies that shaped the political, economic, and military history of the world in the last half-century." End quote. Construction of the base began in 1947. Soon after, strange objects were captured on radar. Quote, "Numerous radar devices within Loring tracked 40 unidentified targets at 10:30 a.m. on the 6th of December, 1950. Because there were so many objects, it was thought that enemy bombers were en route via Europe toward the northeast coast of the United States. The objects were last tracked at 32,000 feet and then vanished. The White House was notified at 10:32 a.m. and President Truman discussed the objects in a meeting with British Prime Minister Clement Attlee." End quote. Numerous encounters continued for over 2 decades, which seemed to culminate over 3 nights in October of 1975. On the evening of October 27th, Sergeant Clifton W. Blakesley and Staff Sergeants William J. Long and Denny Lewis, who were assigned to the 42nd Security Police Squadron, were all on duty at the munitions storage area at Loring. It was a typical evening monitoring base activity when the stillness of the early evening was interrupted at 7:45 p.m. The men observed a red light floating about 300 feet above the base, which violated the restricted airspace over Loring. Reporting the light immediately, Staff Sergeant Lewis noted that he could not see any doors or windows on the object, nor any propellers or engines which would keep the object in the air. The next evening, on the 28th, at precisely 7:45 p.m. again, Staff Sergeant Lewis and Sergeants Long and Blakesley observed another unidentified flying object, but this time on radar about 3 miles away. Soon after, the 3 men then visually observed the UFO, after which Staff Sergeant Lewis notified the base command. Around that same time, a captain and a B-52 air commander observed a white light in the sky. It appeared to be hovering over the runway, and when a helicopter approached the object, it appeared to either take off rapidly or its light blinked out. Not long after that, another UFO was sighted over the base. This was first acknowledged by Sergeant Stephen Eichner and Sergeant Jones, and was described as, quote, "a silent orange and red object shaped like an elongated football. It was hovering over the runway about 4 car lengths long. It was solid, with no doors or windows, and with no visible propellers or engines," end quote. It was observed hovering, moving about, and then it disappeared. Moments later, it was spotted over the runway about 150 feet off the ground. As numerous base personnel looked on in awe, a plan was devised with Maine State Police and APs to confront the craft from the ground. Personnel piled into a truck and drove down a road that paralleled the runway. Once they reached the turn to the nuclear weapons storage facility, the craft was approximately 300 feet in front of the truck and reportedly hovering only 5 feet off the ground. Sergeant Eichner later said, quote, "There were these waves in front of the object and all of the colors were blending together. The object was solid and we could not hear any noise coming from it," end quote. The APs and state police descended upon the runway and halted within 20 yards of the object. before they could act in any meaningful way, the object disappeared. The following days were hectic at the base. A spokesperson was fielding media inquiries, and there was even rumors about the men in black removing log entries about the sightings and telling personnel not to speak with news outlets. Sightings persisted after these events, even after the closure of the base. In 2017, I traveled to Loring for myself and had my own experience. I first arrived on base on the 18th of April 2017 at around 1:30 p.m., and I was utterly unprepared for how desolate and abandoned the place would feel. Roadways were cracked from vegetation, and the former military housing area would be the perfect set piece for The Last of Us. Large hangars appeared fatigued and bled rust, and the runways were massive and felt like they were from another decade. I looked inside buildings through broken windows and took hundreds of pictures. I made sure to identify the areas I wanted to visit after dark and noted how to get back to them come nightfall. I left the base around 3:30 p.m. and got a bite to eat. I napped afterward and headed back out at around 9:30 p.m. I arrived back at Loring around 10 p.m. and was surprised at how different the base was at night. There were no lights. I don't know why I thought there would be, but the only signs of life were from the Loring Job Corps campus. But once I left the grounds, the base swallowed me completely. I was lost for about 20 minutes as I searched for Tower Road, which is how you get to the radar tower and runways. I planned to hang out on the runway for a while, as it had an unobstructed view of the sky. After utilizing Google Maps, I was able to find my way. I parked awkwardly in what I considered to be the closest area to where the UFO was spotted over the runway in 1975. I shut off my headlights and the engine and watched the skies. I did this for over an hour, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. I then drove over to the Arch hangar, located directly across Tower Road. This thing is a behemoth, and in the darkness, it felt like it was 300 feet tall. It's actually 90. I parked near its entrance and used the light from my full spectrum camera screen to light my way. I took some pictures and had a brief EVP session by the open door, but again, I heard nothing and saw nothing out of the ordinary. I then got back into my vehicle and decided to drive to the parking lot of the radar tower to watch the skies from that vantage point. Once parked, my head was on a swivel. Just after midnight, as I looked into the sky, I noticed a light. It was below the cloud layer, which meant it was not a celestial object. At that moment, I could only gawk at the object like anyone else would. Being an investigator was the furthest thing from my mind. I had all my gear in the passenger seat and didn't even grab it. I finally realized I was holding my cell phone, and I accessed the camera and hit record. As I was recording, I decided that I wanted to move underneath the object. I shifted into drive and let my foot off the gas, and I rolled about 5 feet. This was when the light suddenly flashed and swirled, and then it blinked out. I was mad at myself for moving the vehicle and not utilizing my gear. Despite this, when I played back the footage, I found I'd capture the entire series of events. I stayed at Loring for another 2 hours before departing. I drove back to the runways, visited an abandoned building, and skulked about the property without further incident. I finally left and arrived back in my hotel around 3 a.m. I then began analyzing the footage. It wasn't all that compelling, so I took a screenshot of the light, zoomed in, and played with the lighting and colors. The light had an implied structure, but it wasn't easy to discern any actual detail. It truly was an unidentified flying object. I finally drifted off to sleep and eventually left the area in the late morning. With all the reports of unusual sightings for over 7 decades, I felt as though the base and what occupies its airspace accepted me that night. I was allowed a glimpse and will remember that encounter for the rest of my life.